this video, we're going to learn about the user interface for Amazon Sumerian. So let's get started. Okay, we are here at the Amazon Sumerian dashboard. If you log into your AWS console and you click on Amazon Sumerian, this is where it'll take you. And so what we have here is our recent scenes up here on top. And so these are a lot of scenes that I have previously built and worked on for other tutorials and walkthroughs and demos. And then below that, we have scene templates. So if you open these up, a pre-made template with some assets and entities will already be incorporated into your scene. But to get started, what we are going to do is just create a new scene from up here. One thing I would like to add, however, is that if you do come down here to the, let's see, we can scroll down. If you do come down to the scene templates, the empty scene and the default lighting scenes. These are the two scenes that are most common. An empty scene really has nothing in it but a camera, and the default lighting scene has some special lighting and already pre-built into your scene. And also a sky sphere. We will get into the differences between those two just real shortly, but we are going to start with an empty template or an empty scene. So if I click this down here or this create new scene button up here, this will take us to the same type of scene. But I should also say before we get into that, if you click drafts, this will show all of your scenes that you've been working on. Of course, trash is anything you've deleted. And then projects, you can create projects to group scenes into projects. And so if you want to house a bunch of scenes into a specific project, you can do that over here. So let's just get started by clicking create new scene. I'm going to call this user interface intro. And once the scene loads, we will have a new scene. Here it is. This is Amazon Sumerian. And what we have here is in the middle is our canvas. We will talk about how to use the canvas briefly. We do have a grid in our scene, and we will talk about how to remove that. And in the background, we have nothing but a gray background. And if you look over here in the entities panel, we do have a default camera. So that's really the only thing that exists in your scene is this default camera. So we will get to that shortly, but let's start up here in the top left and then move our way down, and we'll cover all the different panels and all the different things you can do in Amazon Sumerian. Well, not all the different things, but many of the things you can do regarding these panels and sections of the UI. All right, so let's start up here in the scene drop-down menu. Click here. This is where you can start new scenes, open existing scene, save. It's important to note that scenes automatically save every 30 seconds. So if you make a change to your scene and you want to exit your scene, make sure you save it if it hasn't been 30 seconds. And in the bottom left-hand corner, it also says whether or not a scene has saved or not. So you can monitor it yourself. But it's always helpful just to save your scene before you exit, just to make sure it captures all of your changes. If you want to duplicate your scene, and also you can publish a scene by clicking the Publish button. We'll do that at the very end. But we'll just, so that is the scene drop-down menu. We'll keep moving on. The Tools drop-down menu. This takes you to the different types of editors that exist within Amazon Sumerian. And so there's a text editor. So text editor is good for editing speeches, editing script files, editing HTML code, anything that you have that requires a text editor or it requires text editing. This is how you can quickly toggle over to that text editor. Same thing with the state machine. We're not going to cover really what the state machine is, other than say that it is the component that adds behaviors and interactivity into your scene. So instead of having a stagnant scene where nothing happens, the state machine is what will make things happen and trigger actions and events and behaviors. The timeline is another component that we're not going to get into, but I'll say briefly the timeline is a component you can use to animate entities and make changes, and you can put cameras on a timeline. You can animate entities and make them move and change position based on timeline. So if you're comfortable with Adobe After Effects or even a little bit in Premiere, the timeline will make a lot of sense because you use keyframes to make those animations and those changes. So that is the Tools drop-down menu. Moving over, Create Entity. To start off with any basic entities, this is a great place to start. So we'll click Create Entity, and this will pull up a small library of entities that we can add into our scene. So at the top category, we have 3D primitives. So that just includes a box or cubes and cones and cylinders and other types of shapes. Then we have 2D shapes, which of course are just two-dimensional. So we have circles and then a rectangle and then a rounded rectangle, triangle. And also an important one is an HTML entity. And then below that we have others, which is the empty entity, which just says entity. What that is it is a empty entity that can store other entities. So think of it like a folder that can contain multiple entities within it. So it doesn't have anything. It doesn't have any. There's no object attached to it. It's mainly used to house other entities. HTML 3D entities here, as well as particles and the timeline if you want to add it. And then below that is lights and cameras. So lights, there are 3 different types: point, directional, and spot. And cameras, there are 4 different types: orbit, fly, fixed, and 2D. The only one we're really going to talk about in this tutorial is the orbit camera. And we'll get to that in a short while. The default camera, however, it is something to remember. It is an orbit camera. So the default camera, although it doesn't say orbit, it is an orbit cam. So we will get to that shortly. But that's the Create Entity menu. We'll close that out. Actually, before we do that, let's just we'll just add a box into our scene. There we go. So then now a box appears into our scene. We'll get to that in a bit. Let's keep moving to the Import Assets button. Click Import Assets button, and this will open up the asset library. This is a public library that our team is adding to, and this is where you can find the Sumerian hosts, as well as some other assets that some of these actually can be found on Amazon.com, some of these objects. So if you type in the asset number below some of these furniture items in Amazon.com, you will actually pull up this actual piece of furniture and you can purchase it. So that's what the asset library is. It just has a few really useful assets or entities, objects that you can add into your scene. And we're going to be using that using many of these in the following tutorials. But that's where you find some of them, as well as this. It's important if you want to do AR into your scene. Some of the important assets can be found here, as well as we have some songs that we have pulled from one of our really favorite tools out there, which is Juke Deck. So where you can create your own customized music. So we've added some music and songs there as well. We're not going to add anything right now, so I'll just go ahead and click Cancel. Moving on over, if you click the Help drop-down menu, this can take you quickly over to the tutorials, user guide, scripting API, and a few other things, as well as Slack. We have our own Slack channel for Amazon Sumerian. And then if you want to log out, you can just click your account drop-down over here, and you can log out of your current account. All right, so that is the top menu bar. Let's start looking at some of the panels in Sumerian. The Entities panel is an important one. This is where it holds all of your entities that are currently in your scene. So right now we have the top level entity, which is User Interface Intro. If you remember, that's what I named the scene. And so whatever you name the scene will always appear up here. And this has its own specific components that you can see over here in the inspector panel. And everything that's in your scene will exist under this top level entity. We'll get into what these different components are in just a moment. But if we click the box, notice that we get some handles that appear attached to the box. And if you want to select a different entity, you can either select it in your scene or you can select it in the Entities panel. The default camera, you can't really see it because it is the camera that we're viewing our scene with. So you can't see it because it's what you're actually using to view your scene. However, if you do have a camera highlighted or selected, you can see a preview down here in the bottom left-hand corner of your canvas. And right now, because we only have one camera, it is reflecting exactly what we're seeing here already in the canvas. Also, if you want to hide any entities, you can click the hide button and they will still exist in your scene, but you just won't be able to see them. Default camera does not work like that, but the box does, and pretty much all other entities. You can search for entities. You can also undo and redo some actions as well as duplicate. So if I click my box and duplicate it. I now have box and then box 2. You can't see them in the scene quite yet. We'll show you how in a moment, but you can also delete them up here if you want to get rid of any entities. So that is the entities panel. It's basically your list of everything that's in your scene. Below that is the assets panel. It's related to the entities panel, but it's a much larger library that holds everything that is not just in your scene, but anything you've added to this specific project. And so the reason why this is useful is that entities oftentimes have a lot of different asset types that comprise one object. And so a host has a mesh, it has textures, it has animations, it has behaviors attached to it. So there's so many different things that can go into one asset or object. And so the assets panel will hold all of those different things. Whereas the entities panel will only have the entities that appear in your scene. And again, in other tutorials and a little bit later, you'll see a little bit more of how the assets panel works. But it is a really useful panel to use, and if you get comfortable using it, your workflow when you create scenes will move a lot faster. So that is the entities panel and the assets panel. So moving on, let's flip to the other side of the screen. This over here on the right-hand side is the inspector panel. So whatever you have selected over in the entities panel will be reflected over in the inspector panel. And based whatever entity you have selected, entities can be different types, of course. So there are cameras, there are objects, there are hosts, there's all sorts of different entity types. And depending on what it is, they'll have different components attached to it. So when I click the default camera entity, the inspector panel changes a little bit, especially because it has a camera component attached to the camera, of course, as well as a script component that has some parameters and some, well, not actually with the default camera. You can't edit the properties for the default camera, but if you add other cameras to your scene, you will be able to edit and change various properties and parameters for that camera. Also, how we mentioned, the top level entity, if you click this up here, we get a very, very specific set of components over in the inspector panel. So your AWS configuration, so if you want to add AWS IoT, if you want to integrate Lex or Poly, you would you would unfold this, add your Cognito identity pool here, and then your scene would be connected to your AWS account. Also, environment and post effects and scene size, scene stats, everything that's related to the global scene settings, that can be found when you have the top level entity selected. If I do select the box, let's say, and I can always add other components. If I click add component, we can add a camera component, collider, host, dialog, and all these different component types here. And we can add all of them, and this panel can start filling up. But again, when you add certain entities to your scene, it will have different component types over here in the inspector panel. The inspector panel is where you'll be doing a lot of your editing. And so a lot of your property changes and texture changes and values for your transform can all be found over here in the inspector panel. Speaking of transform, now that I have box selected over here in the entities panel, and you can see it's highlighted and selected here in the canvas, let's unfold the transform component to understand a little bit more about what this is. The transform component is the component that controls the positioning of your entity within your scene. So it's translation, so I'll hover over here. Translation in this top row of values is essentially the position or location within a scene. So if I change this number to this X value to 1, it moves over. If I change the Y value to 1, it moves up, and Z value to 1, it will move over again. So now you see I have two boxes, and that's because there's a box 1 and then a box 2. I duplicated it a few minutes ago, and you didn't see a change. That's because they're both sitting in the same spot. But now that I've moved one, you can start seeing all the entities in our scene, or the duplicated entities. Also, you can click in these values and scrub, meaning you click and drag up and down, and you can move your entities that way. And it works for the translation. It also works for rotation, so I can rotate it around the x-axis. I can rotate around the y-axis, and I can rotate around the z-axis. Scale has to do with its size, so I'll zoom out here a bit. And if I increase this by 3, and the uniform scale box is checked, it will increase in scale on all 3 fronts, and so it is 3 times as large. Let's take that back down to 1. And if you unclick the uniform scale, it will only change, the entity will only change scale values along that axis. So if I unclick this and change this to 3, notice it's not really a box anymore. It's a box, but it's an elongated box. All right, so that is the transform component. Very, very useful, very important, and you will probably be using this in every single scene. All right, now that we have looked a little bit at the inspector panel, the entities panel, and the assets panel, let's look at the kind of the heart of Amazon Sumerian, which is the canvas, and also our viewport, as some people call it. The canvas is where you can see what's in your scene. So it gets the visual representation of your scene. The first thing that I want to point out is these arrows or handles that you have attached to your entity. If you click and drag these, you can move them visually within your scene. And notice as I do that, those transform values that we just discussed do change based on its new or its changing location. Now, I do have a couple buttons over here. The first one is the translate. So this is the translate handles appear on this box, and so I can move the box to various translation values within my scene, or positional values. If I click the rotate, I get some rings, and then I can rotate it manually or visually. And same thing with scale. I get some scale handles that allow me to increase the shape and size of my box based on scale. Moving over is the full shading drop-down menu. The full shading allows you to look at your entities through different shading renders, and so if you click on full shading and we click on wireframes, then we see everything just based on their wireframes. But we will go back to full shading. The toggle skybox button, which is next in line, is the box that will turn on and off your skybox, which is a background box that is infinitely large around your scene, and it covers the background and it's as the shape of a box. We don't have anything. We don't have a skybox currently, so if we turn this on and off, it won't do anything. We will get to that in later tutorials. And the toggle grid button will turn on and off your grid. I prefer to keep it on because it always helps you have a better reference for your scene. And also your toggle post effects button. If you have post effects like blurs or glows or blooms, things like that, you can turn them on and off quickly right here. Your editor camera drop-down button, if you have multiple cameras within your scene, you can quickly toggle between those cameras. And then these frame select buttons. These are very, very useful. So let's say I'm zoomed all the way out, and I have a big scene, and I want to look at box 2. Not box 1, but I want to look at box 2. Well, instead of locating it within my scene, I can simply select it over here in the Entities panel. If I click the F button or click this button, I tend to use the F button on my keyboard instead. It'll frame that scene, that entity in the middle of our canvas nice and large. And if I need to zoom out or zoom in a little bit, I can. So that's a quick way, and I'll click the bigger box or box 1, select that, and it frames all of it within our canvas. It's a much faster way to find entities and zoom in on them rather than trying to position your camera and manually move your camera into position. And the next one over is the frame all button. So the same thing with this is if you hold the shift button and click F, this will frame everything in your scene within view on your canvas. We don't have a lot in our scene right now. We just have these 2 boxes. So if I click shift and F at the same time, just gives us a little bit different view, but not much. And let's see, lastly, to enter VR, this button down here, it will allow you to go into VR. However, you do need to add some different components and some assets to your scene to make that work. But that is the button that you can quickly go in and out of VR if you have your HMD and your VR rig set up. Also, these expand buttons, panel buttons here, you can collapse the left-hand panels there on the left, and then your inspector panel there on the right, and then your play, pause, and stop button. If you want to enter play mode, meaning you want to actually see what your scene looks like live, click play, and that'll enter play mode, and you can see what your scene will do when it's actually live. Pause and stop, of course, will pause and stop your scene. All right, the last thing that we haven't covered is how do you control your camera view within your scene? You notice that I've been kind of orbiting around this box, and how am I doing that? I'm using my mouse. You can use a trackpad if you want, and depending on your trackpad settings and how they correspond to your right click and left click on your button, that's kind of up to your personal settings. But I'll just quickly explain the general mouse button settings and how the mouse controls for your camera. So remember how I said that the default camera is an orbit cam. And what that means is it will start orbiting around a center point. So if I have box 2, or let's do box 2 selected, and I click the F key, it'll then position it so where it's in the middle of my scene. If I hold the right mouse button and drag it left or right, I will start orbiting around that selected entity. And I can go around it, I can go up and down, but either way, I am orbiting in every direction around this entity. I can zoom in and out using my scroll wheel. So zoom out, I can get away from the entity. I can zoom in using the scroll wheel. Again, if I want to click on it quickly, I can press the F key. If I want to change the center point of my camera, I can click on box 2 or any other entity, click the F button, and then I can reframe it. And now my center point is on this box. However, you don't have to be locked in on a specific entity for your center point. You can also just click the Shift button, and holding the Shift button, I should say, and clicking and dragging with the left mouse button will allow you to pan up and down, left and right. So as I do this, now I have a totally new center point for my orbit. And it's always in the middle of your scene, so right in here is where I'm really orbiting around. Again, if I want to focus back on box 2, I just click select it in the entities panel, then click F, and there I am. So yeah, that is an orbit cam, or the default cam that comes with most default scenes. To control it, I'll just review, is my right mouse button allows me to orbit around in all different directions around my entity. And then holding the Shift and then dragging the left mouse button will allow me to pan left and right, up and down. However, one thing I will note is that is for editor mode. If we enter play mode, it operates just a little bit differently. The reason being, you can't select entities to edit them because you're in play mode. So the way this works is it's essentially switched. If you hold your right mouse button and drag, that'll allow you to pan, and then your left mouse button will allow you to orbit around a center point. You can't quickly select an entity and focus on it, but you are orbiting around that center point. And it can change, of course, and that is the orbit cam and how you control the camera settings within your scene. All right, so that's the basics of Amazon Sumerian, the user interface. Let's quickly just look at one other thing. I'm going to click the scene drop-down menu, and if I wanted to publish this scene, I would just click publish. I can publish this here. I'm not going to right now, and that'll give me a unique URL right here. I'll close that. I do want to show you before we leave is I'll exit to the dashboard, go back to my home here. Remember, we created an empty scene. Now I want to create a default lighting scene. And then I will call this UI lighting. I just want to show you the difference between the empty scene and the default lighting scene. Right away, you should notice that there are a few different things going on here. It's lighter, and it's blue. So the things that we have in this scene that are different are we have 3 different lights. So if I expand this, the default lights parent entity, I have 3 different light types. I have a fill, a key, and a rim, all directional lights. We'll get into what directional lights are in another tutorial, but you can also see them. If I select them, you can see those lights positioned in your scene. So I do have some professional lighting already added to this template, and as well as this blue background, which this is a sky sphere. So it's a 360-degree image that's surrounding your scene that has a blue gradient that gets darker blue as you move away from the horizon up and down. And so that can be found if you go to your top level entity and you go to environment and you unfold the environment component. There it is. There's our blue sky sphere. And you can edit that if you like and go look at it. But that is what we're seeing, and so that's what comes. So it really looks like it is a blue sky. And essentially, that's the most of it. Most important parts to get started for Sumerian. Thanks for joining us. We hope you watch the next video. Thanks.